This is the Matilda I tank that was first designed in the middle of the 1930s as what was called an infantry support tank. And the idea was, think like World War I, a tank going ahead of the infantry to crush down barbed wire, with its machine gun suppress the enemy positions, and then your infantry could follow on behind. So they didn't mind it being slow. It's actually got very thick armour on it, but with just that one machine gun, not much in the way of firepower. And even as this went into service, this Matilda I tank it was called, even as it went into service, they realised it's a bit of a tank on the cheap. So they start designing a better version, and that's called the Matilda II. And at the moment, our Matilda II is in the workshops. We're just starting a restoration programme on that vehicle. And again, if you're interested, we're going to be putting that restoration on our website online so you can see how that progresses. £5,000 each these tanks cost, including the development cost. And they make about 140 of them, and apart from one little moment of glory at the Battle of Arras in 1940, when Matilda I's and 18 Matilda II tanks attacked an advancing German column, that was their lot. Most of them were left in France at the end of that campaign. The Germans picked up some, used one or two of them out on the Eastern Front for internal patrol duties behind the lines, but most of them were scrapped. We're very lucky here. We've got that one that runs, and we've got another complete one in the museum. And some of you may have noticed that we've also got a shell, a wreck of one from the range that you drive past on the way into the museum. So that's an infantry tank. We follow it up with a Matilda II infantry tank, and then we come along with the Valentine, which is also supposed to be an infantry tank as well. The Valentine, though, is actually a fair bit faster than the Matilda II. It doesn't need speed, because again, infantry tank, helping the infantry onto a position. They start with the Valentine having a 2-pounder gun. It's a vehicle that's actually put together by Vickers. The Army hasn't asked for it, but because they use components that they've had on other tanks, such as the suspension system, it's actually fairly reliable. And for a British tank at the time, that's quite extraordinary, because most of our tanks were notoriously unreliable early on in the war. Now, this particular example of the Valentine, it was made in Britain. Some Valentines, about 8,000 Valentines are made altogether. About 1,200 are made out in Canada. And most of those are actually shipped straight over to help the Red Army fight on the Eastern Front. The Valentine goes through a whole load of different marks, in other words, different improvements. And the one in front of you is a Mark 9. The first tank only had a 2-pounder gun on, that's about 40 millimetres. This one is a 6-pounder gun, 57 millimetres. That's the size of the hole at the end of the barrel. And they made the turret larger so that they could get 3 guys in the turret rather than the 2 in the earlier models. And again, it's a tank that's often underrated in tank histories because it's the one we made the most of in Britain in World War II. The Russians actually liked it because it was reliable, didn't have much firepower, but it kept going. And when it went into service, it saw sterling service out in the Western Desert, North Africa, and then later it was used for putting lots of other experimental or variant vehicles, bits on the top, bridge layers, flamethrowers, all sorts of things were done with the Valentine. The first floating tanks were actually Valentine conversions. Now, next one coming on, you can hear that lovely rumble. That engine in the back of this tank, this is the Comet tank. That engine finally gave British tanks a bit of welly so that they could be upped in weight and upped in speed. And that's the famous Rolls-Royce engine in the back that was in the Spitfire. It was called the Merlin. They derated it, they changed it a very little bit and then put it in a tank, and they called it the Meteor. And that gives the Comet that lovely rumbling sound because of that big engine in the back, hugely thirsty of course, being a petrol engine of that scale. But the Comet is what's called a cruiser tank. And the idea was the infantry tanks make the hole, and then the cruiser tanks were supposed to go through the gap. And early in the war, our cruiser tanks, again, they suffered from unreliability. But by the time the Comet's coming into service, in late 1944, at last we've got a good engine, And of course, the most important thing on a tank, a gun. This is a shortened version of the famous 17-pounder gun we put on the Firefly. Now on this particular model, it's actually about 20% lighter than the standard 17-pounder gun on the Firefly, the Sherman Firefly tank. And that gun, designed British ammunition, what they call discarding Sabo ammunition, that actually has better penetration than the famous Panther tank of the German army with its 75mm gun. So at last we had, in late 1944, they're being issued in December of 1944, at last we've got a cruiser tank with enough firepower to take on some of those German vehicles. As they were issuing these tanks, the famous German attack at the Battle of the Bulge starts. They didn't finish training on the tank, so they went to fight in the more usual of the vehicles they were used to, such as the Cromwells and the Shermans in most of the British armoured regiments. So from that point of view, it doesn't actually see much service. Early in 1945 it gets going again, and it sees a little bit of service, but a number of armies around the world kept their Comets in service till an awful lot later. The Irish Army only got rid of some of its ones at the end of the 1970s. Burma had Comets in service into the 1980s. So a very important tank in British tank development, because at last we were getting it right in terms of firepower, armour protection and a fair bit of mobility. And the next tank that comes on, again a bit of context, this is the famous Centurion tank that a number of blokes in the audience, you probably had your dinky toy model of this famous vehicle. The Centurion, weirdly, is, when you look at it, it's actually a World War II tank. The very first models are built in the beginning of 1945. It's rushed out to Germany, the Mark I Centurion, and it misses the end of the war by 6 weeks. It goes on to be that absolute epitome of a brilliant bit of British engineering design. It has a superb gun, and it was upgunned. They started with a 17-pounder, then a 20-pounder, then the gun on this particular model of the tank, the L7 105mm gun. And basically that gun would have knocked out any tanks at all in the 1950s and way through to the mid-1960s. It was tremendously powerful, very, very accurate. And the Germans borrowed that gun. They put it on their first version of the Leopard tank. The Americans borrowed it. They put it on the M60 tank. And they also had it on the early models of the modern Abrams tank as well. It was that good a weapon. And it's a great example, again, of how a good tank can be improved on. If the basic model is right, they could up-gun it, they could up-armour it, they added fuel capacity because it was actually a very thirsty tank. That was the one weakness of the Centurion. It ran out of petrol a bit too soon because it's so thirsty. They actually added an armoured petrol bowser that would be carried behind it, and it was armoured. It was always a bit of a problem, and of course you can see modern tanks still have that as a bit of an issue, which is why they often have extra fuel drums on the rear to help extend its range. This particular Centurion, it's a late model. It spent its last days as what they call an AVRE, Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers. It has a dozer blade put on the front of it. Centurions, the last version of Centurion was actually something called a beach armoured recovery vehicle. That only came out of service in about 2003 in the British Army. So it's a tank that's still in service, by the way, in South Africa, and also, of course, the Israeli Army has got versions of it converted. So a fantastically successful tank, just a bit too late to see action in the Second World War. Now the next tank coming on, again, bit of context. This one as well, this is the famous American Sherman tank. And from the Western Allies' point of view, this is the tank that basically saves our bacon. Our own tank industry, in 1940, we were building aeroplanes and bombers, obviously, to get back at the Germans, fighters to defend ourselves. Tanks fell in priority at the beginning of the war. And when the Americans come into the war, in December of 1941, they've already sent engineers to Europe to look at what they think is going to be needed. The first tank they build, you can see in the museum, the M3 Grant tank. That has a 75mm howitzer in the hull and an armour-piercing high-velocity gun in the turret on the top. Now that was only an interim model. The tank they really wanted to build was this one, the Sherman. And the early models of the Sherman have a 75mm dual-purpose gun in the turret. That means it can fire high explosive rounds and armour-piercing. Our 2-pounder guns on the some of the early British tanks could only fire armour-piercing rounds, so they weren't useful against infantry. And the Sherman as well, it ends up being one of those tanks that we perhaps sometimes compare with tanks like the Tiger, but it wasn't designed to fight other tanks. That's the thing we miss out on. The idea, the American philosophy was you break through a front line with infantry and artillery, you have tank destroyers, lightweight vehicles for knocking out enemy tanks, and this, imagine this like the cavalry, it was supposed to shoot through the gap and cause trouble behind enemy lines. It wasn't really meant for taking on enemy armour. And in fact, General Patton famously would actually tell off his tank crews if they started stopping their advances to engage with German tanks. He thought that was a waste of their talents. This particular Sherman, quite famous now, it's the one we led to the Fury movie set, hence Fury on the barrel. It's the main tank, the hero tank as it were of the film. It's a later war Sherman, and the Sherman goes through a number of improvements during its development. This one has a 76mm gun, high velocity gun, twin diesel engine in the back, thicker armour, wider tracks, and a key thing for the crew, it has what they call wet stowage. In other words, the actual ammunition is now surrounded in its stowage compartments by water or fluid, so that if you're penetrated, and don't forget the armour on this is fairly thin, if you're penetrated by an enemy anti-tank gun or an enemy tank, hopefully any rounds, any hot bits of metal will be put out by that water jacket around the ammunition before it would set fire to the ammunition, because this rather mythic phrase, Tommy cooker for the Sherman tank, it was nothing to do about the petrol engine setting fire, it was much more to do about ammunition cooking off. And once they've got that wet stowage in place, actual crew casualties went down. Now, you can see a German tank entering the arena now, going around. This is the Panzer III, a very typical German tank of the Second World War. Panzer I, Panzer II, it was the tanks the German army built to start training with. Panzer III, Panzer IVs is what the German army wanted to go to war with. And they are beautifully engineered, fantastically well-made vehicles. When this Panzer III was captured, one of the reports on it that we have here was all about crew ergonomics. You can see the commander in the turret there. He's right in the middle of that turret. Either side of him in the turret, on the left-hand side is the gunner, on the right-hand side is the loader. So literally by moving his knee, he can tap them on the shoulder. That they realised was really important in battle, having good eye-line, eyesight for command and control, because again, that reassures the crew. Driver and radio operator are further down in the front of the vehicle. Now this particular vehicle was also captured out in Tunisia, not far from where our Tiger was captured, brought back to the UK for evaluation in the war. And you can see as well with it, it's got extra armour bolted on the front. That was the other things the Germans were quite clever at, and we took a while to learn, which is how you upgrade your tanks. Give them the capacity to have a bigger gun fitted. This started the war with a low-velocity 50mm gun. This version has got a high-velocity 50mm gun. Much longer, more powerful, more accurate. And extra armour bolted on the front to add to the protection levels. So again, beautiful design, completely impractical in wartime. They just didn't have the capacity to build enough of these. It's like building Rolls-Royce cars all the time. Absolutely lovely, but what's the point if in the middle of a battle what you really need is a Ford Escort? That's the problem with many of these German vehicles. And you'll have noticed we've taken out our Kettenkrad, just to give it a bit of an airing. Again, that was captured in North Africa from Ranker's paratroop brigade that was fighting alongside the Tigers, and again brought back to the UK for evaluation. Looked like a motorbike on steroids. Now, I'll let the Tiger run around and you can just have a listen to it.
sit still.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that's our Tiger. We all obviously always drive it rather carefully around our track here. We don't put it up to its full limit. Just out of interest, 28 miles an hour for a Sherman. The Tiger's only a couple of miles an hour slower. So do remember, it's actually a very, very mobile vehicle. And don't believe all the normal stuff we say, too slow, too heavy. Now, coming on now is what the Germans built after the war. This is the famous Leopard tank. They start designing it. The Bundeswehr is reconstructed in 1955. They start the design process for building a tank. And this is what comes out in 1965, the Leopard 1. They start with the standard Panzer. Really interesting. The Germans decided different things of what we decided after World War II. They thought that speed, in other words mobility, was going to be more important than armour protection. So they gave it that great gun, that's the British 105mm gun on it. They gave it an MTU diesel engine, which you can hear it rumbling away, very powerful, made the tank very fast and speedy, and then they don't worry too much about armour because they think speed will be protection in itself. The quicker you are on the battlefield, the less chance you're going to have of the enemy knocking you out. Now in Britain after the war we went the other way. We decided that we wanted firepower first, armour protection second, and mobility last on this. Hence we ended up with Chieftain and then Challenger. Now all the tanks, they've changed slightly in the sense of being able to be upgraded. So the Leopard tank, they've added more armour, even on this version, which was actually made for the Canadian Army. You can see extra armour has been added to the turret, and then later there was actually a second version of the Leopard 2, a very different tank, but again, they build on that mobility, power the tank's got, and you can see that a very successful vehicle. Lots of countries around the world have actually got the Leopard in service, and very interestingly for all concerned as well, my betting is there's going to be a Euro Leopard sometime in the future to replace all the different armies that gave up their tanks, like the Canadians, who very kindly gave us this tank, and then decided they needed them back into service. So tanks, the story is certainly not over, but there's a nice example of how things that were learned and things that weren't learned or understood differently by different nations after the Second World War.